The violin case was held together with duct tape and hope, its leather cracked like weathered hands that had known too much work and too little rest. Marcus Williams clutched it close as he made his way through the gleaming marble lobby of Sterling Financial Tower, his janitor's uniform crisp despite the early morning hour. He'd pressed it himself the night before, after his 8-year-old daughter Emma had finally fallen asleep, her small hand still clutching the drawing she'd made of them. Playing music together, a dream that felt as distant as the stars she'd wished upon. The elevator hummed softly as it carried Marcus to the 32nd floor, where he'd spend the next 8 hours ensuring that executives in $1,000 suits never had to think about empty trash cans or dusty windowsills. It was honest work, he reminded himself, the same words his late wife, Sarah, had whispered during her final days in the hospital. "Music will wait," she'd said, her fingers tracing the calluses on his fingertips. Calluses that once came from violin strings, but now formed from mop handles and cleaning supplies. But Emma can't wait for her daddy to come home. That was 3 years ago, 3 years since the medical bills had forced him to sell his position with the city orchestra. 3 years since he'd traded concert halls for corporate corridors, melodies for mundane tasks. Yet every day at noon, when the 32nd floor emptied for lunch meetings and power lunches, Marcus would find his way to the abandoned conference room at the end of the hall. There, surrounded by dust motes dancing in afternoon sunlight, he would open that battered case and let his soul breathe again. He didn't know that today everything would change. The morning passed like countless others. Marcus worked methodically through his checklist, his movements efficient and nearly invisible to the stream of employees who flowed past him, like water around a stone. He emptied wastebaskets filled with discarded dreams disguised as crumpled proposals, dusted picture frames that held smiling families he'd never meet, and polished conference tables that hosted decisions worth more than his annual salary. At 11:47 a.m., he made his way to the supply closet that served as his temporary refuge, washing his hands with the same care a surgeon might take before an operation. The violin was waiting, as it always was, patient and faithful. His fingers trembled slightly as he lifted it from its case, not from nerves, but from anticipation. This instrument had been Sarah's wedding gift to him, purchased with money she'd saved from working double shifts at the diner, where they'd first met. The conference room welcomed him like an old friend. Tall windows overlooked the city below, where thousands of people hurried through their lives, each carrying their own invisible burdens. Marcus positioned himself near the window, letting the natural light warm his face as he raised the violin to his chin. The first note that emerged was soft, tentative, like a bird testing its wings after a long winter. What Marcus didn't know was that Catherine Sterling, CEO of Sterling Financial and the woman whose name graced the building, was working through lunch in her office just down the hall. At 52, Catherine had built an empire through ruthless efficiency and calculated decisions. She'd sacrificed personal relationships for professional success, convinced that sentiment was a luxury she couldn't afford in the cutthroat world of finance. Her corner office was a testament to her achievements, awards, photographs with politicians, and a view of the city she'd helped shape through strategic investments and corporate acquisitions. But today, something stopped her mid-sentence during a video conference with Tokyo investors. A sound so pure, so achingly beautiful, that it seemed to pierce through decades of carefully constructed armor around her heart. She held up a finger to pause the meeting, her breath catching as the melody continued to drift through the walls. The music was Pachelbel's canon, but played with such raw emotion that it became something entirely new. Each note carried the weight of love and loss, of dreams deferred but not forgotten. Catherine found herself drawn from her desk, her expensive heels silent on the carpet as she moved toward the source of the sound. Through the slightly open door of the conference room, she could see a figure silhouetted against the window, a man in a janitor's uniform, playing violin as if his life depended on it. Marcus was lost in the music, transported to a time when Sarah would sit in the front row of the concert hall, her eyes shining with pride as he played. He remembered Emma's first steps, taken to the rhythm of a lullaby he'd composed just for her. The violin sang of midnight feedings and bedtime stories, of homework sessions at their tiny kitchen table, and the way his daughter's face lit up when he hummed while making her breakfast. Catherine pressed her hand to her mouth, surprised by the tears that had begun to fall. She hadn't cried in years, not when her father passed, not when her marriage crumbled under the weight of her ambition, not even when the doctors told her she'd waited too long to have children of her own. Yet here she stood watching a janitor pour his heart out through a violin that looked like it had seen better decades, and she felt something break open inside her chest. The melody shifted, becoming more complex, more urgent. Marcus was playing a piece he'd written for Sarah during her illness, a musical love letter that spoke of all the words they'd never had time to say. His fingers moved with practiced precision despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. This was why he played, not for applause or recognition, but for the connection to something larger than himself, something that made the endless cycle of work and worry worthwhile. Catherine recognized the depth of what she was witnessing. This wasn't a performance. It was a prayer, a conversation with the universe conducted in a language that transcended words. She thought of her own father, who had built sterling financial from nothing but had never missed her school plays, never failed to tell her he loved her even when business consumed most of his time. When had she stopped believing that success and humanity could coexist? The final notes of Marcus's impromptu concert hung in the air like incense, sacred and transformative. He lowered the violin slowly, his shoulders sagging as reality crept back in. In 20 minutes, he'd need to be cleaning the executive washroom on the 30th floor. In 6 hours, he'd pick up Emma from aftercare, help her with homework, and try to stretch their grocery budget for another week. Catherine wiped her eyes quickly and returned to her office, her mind racing. The Tokyo call could wait. Everything could wait. She pulled up the employee database and searched until she found him. Marcus Williams, custodial staff, employee number 7432, divorced, one dependent, no disciplinary actions, perfect attendance for 3 years, but the file told her nothing about the man who had just reminded her why she'd fallen in love with music as a child, why she'd studied piano before. Business school convinced her that art was impractical. That afternoon, Catherine found herself doing something unprecedented. She left her office and walked the halls, really looking at her employees for perhaps the first time. She noticed the security guard who nodded politely at everyone who passed, the receptionist who remembered every visitor's name, the maintenance staff who worked quietly and efficiently to keep her world running smoothly. How many of them had stories like Marcus? How many dreams had been set aside for the sake of survival? When the workday ended, Catherine was waiting by the elevator bank. Marcus appeared at 5:30 sharp, his violin case in one hand, his uniform replaced by jeans and a worn sweater. He looked smaller somehow, more vulnerable outside the context of his work environment. "Excuse me," Catherine called out, her voice softer than it had been in years. "Are you Marcus Williams?" Marcus turned, confusion flickering across his face as he recognized the woman approaching him. Everyone knew Catherine Sterling by sight. Her photo was in the lobby, on the company website, in the business journals that littered the waiting areas. She was legend and reality combined, the kind of success story that seemed impossibly distant from his daily experience. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, instinctively straightening his shoulders. "Is there a problem with my work?" "No," Catherine said, and then paused, suddenly unsure of herself. "How did you tell someone that they'd changed your life with a 20-minute violin performance? They thought no one had heard. I heard you playing today. During lunch." Marcus's face flushed red, a mixture of embarrassment and fear. "I'm sorry, Miss Sterling. I didn't think anyone was around." "It won't happen again, I promise. Please don't apologize," Catherine interrupted, her voice gentle. "It was beautiful. The most beautiful thing I've heard in years." She paused, gathering courage for what she was about to say. "Would you be willing to have coffee with me sometime? I'd like to hear your story." The conversation that followed, conducted over coffee in a small cafe near Emma's school, would change both their lives in ways neither could have imagined. Catherine learned about Marcus's background with the city orchestra, about Sarah's illness and death, about the impossible choice between pursuing his passion and providing for his daughter. Marcus discovered that Catherine had been a promising pianist before business school, that she'd built her empire partly as a way to fill the void left by abandoned dreams. "I have a proposition," Catherine said as their second cups grew cold. "I've been thinking about starting a company foundation, something focused on supporting the arts in underserved communities. I need someone who understands both the business side and the human side of music education, someone who knows what it means to sacrifice for art and what it means to sacrifice art for survival." Marcus stared at her, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. "Miss Sterling, I don't have an MBA. I haven't worked in arts administration. I'm just a janitor who plays violin." "You're a musician who's learned how to take care of people," Catherine corrected. "You've been taking care of this building, this company, for 3 years. You've been taking care of your daughter, keeping your family together through impossible circumstances. And today, whether you knew it or not, you took care of me. You reminded me why I loved music in the first place, why I built this company not just for profit, but to create something meaningful." The Sterling Foundation launched 6 months later, with Marcus as its director of community outreach. His first initiative was an after-school music program that provided instruments and instruction to children whose families couldn't afford private lessons. Emma was among the first students, her face radiant as she drew her bow across the strings of a child-sized violin. Catherine began taking piano lessons again, her lunch hours now spent at the same music school where Marcus taught evening classes. She discovered that success felt different when it was measured not just in profits, but in the number of children who learned to express themselves through music, in the number of families who found joy and connection through art. The abandoned conference room on the 32nd floor was converted into a practice space, its walls lined with instruments available for any employee who wanted to explore their musical interests. During lunch hours, the sound of various instruments could be heard. Throughout the building, tentative piano scales from accounting, enthusiastic guitar chords from marketing, the warm tones of Marcus's violin weaving through it all like a golden thread. 1 year after that transformative lunch hour performance, Catherine stood at the window of what was now called the Sterling Music Room, watching Marcus prepare for a special performance. The entire company had gathered, along with families and community members, for the Foundation's first annual benefit concert. Emma sat in the front row, her eyes shining with the same pride Sarah had once shown, her small hands clasped in anticipation. As Marcus raised his violin and began to play, Catherine closed her eyes and listened. The melody was new, something he'd composed just for this moment, a piece about second chances and unexpected connections, about the way music could bridge the gap between different worlds. It spoke of a janitor who had never stopped being an artist, a CEO who had remembered how to be human, and a little girl who would grow up knowing that dreams could be deferred but never truly die. The audience was silent, captivated by the man who had once cleaned their offices and was now changing their community. When the final note faded, the applause was thunderous, but Catherine barely heard it. She was thinking about her father, about the girl she'd been before ambition hardened her heart, about the unexpected gift of discovering that success and compassion weren't mutually exclusive after all. Later, as the evening wound down and the last guests departed, Marcus found Catherine sitting at the piano in the music room, her fingers moving slowly over the keys in a melody he recognized. The same Pachelbel's canon that had started it all. "Thank you," she said without looking up, "for reminding me who I used to be, for showing me who I could still become." Marcus set down his violin case and joined her at the piano bench, his fingers finding harmonies to complement her melody. "Thank you for listening," he replied, "for hearing more than just the notes." As their impromptu duet filled the room, Emma appeared in the doorway, her new violin tucked under her arm. She'd been practicing the same piece, wanting to surprise her father. Without a word, she raised her instrument and added her voice to theirs. 3 musicians from different worlds, united by the universal language that had brought them together. The city sparkled beyond the windows, full of people hurrying through their lives, each carrying their own invisible burdens and hidden dreams. But in that moment, in that room filled with music and possibility, the distance between dreams and reality seemed smaller than it ever had before. Sometimes, Marcus reflected as he played, the most beautiful symphonies begin with a single note, played by someone who believes that music like hope, like kindness, like love itself, is never truly lost, only waiting for the right moment to be heard.